Good afternoon, everyone. It's 12 o'clock and we're going to go ahead and get started. I understand that people will be joining over the next few minutes, and we welcome them and are happy that you are here with us. Aloha and welcome everyone to our second annual Lunch and Learn Speaker Series. I'm Diane Bowen Coleman, and I'm the State Human Trafficking Abatement Coordinator in the Special Investigation and Prosecution Division of the Department of the Attorney General. I'm very pleased to announce our speaker today. Our Lunch and Learn speaker is Dr. Danielle Giroux. Dr. Danielle Giroux serves as the Masters of Social Work Program Chair and Associate Professor of Social Work at Hawaii Pacific University, or HPU. She holds an MSW from HPU and a PhD in Clinical Community Psychology from the University of Alaska, Anchorage. She is also a licensed clinical social worker in Hawaii with a private practice that provides program evaluation and clinical services grounded in acceptance and commitment therapy. Dr. Giroux is involved in research on sex trafficking in Hawaii, primarily collaborating with Ho'ola Napua, an organization dedicated to supporting victims of commercial sexual exploitation. Her current project, funded by the Pacific Innovations Knowledge and Opportunities, or PICO grant, evaluates the Coconut Wireless Curriculum, a therapeutic program designed to improve the well-being, resilience, and self-esteem of trafficked youth. Dr. Giroux's work focuses on providing critical insights and feedback from survivors to enhance the program, with a broader goal of addressing sex trafficking in Hawaii through research and research-driven interventions. So I'm happy to introduce Dr. Giroux.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for that introduction. You covered a lot of information about me. So I will say that this presentation, and I'm going to screen share the slides that I have. So this presentation is about boys and involvement in trafficking and ways that boys enter and who's the buyer, those sorts of things, and sort of what we can do as providers to better meet the needs of boys. I will say before I start that this is not my typical topic. A lot of the content in this presentation is going to be a review of literature. We did do a pretty exhaustive review of literature this past year, and there were really only 4 new studies from the last comprehensive review that was done in 2015. So that 2015 literature review, a lot of their findings, and then the additional articles that we found are part of what's going to be covered in here. Yeah, so it's not my usual topic. So I got into sort of this area of research when I was living in Alaska. I myself, I'm a sexual trauma survivor, not a trafficking survivor, but a sexual trauma survivor. And that kind of pulled me into this area, this line of work, as something I think is important for all of us. So I'm going to actually start us out. Can you can see my presentation? Yes. Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to actually start us out with a survey. So I would like you guys to take a few minutes. I'll give you maybe 5 minutes. There's not a lot of questions on this survey, but this survey is the male rape myths scale. And this is really just for you to gauge or get an idea of how you are thinking about this particular topic before we dive into talking about a lot of the statistics. So you can either click on this URL link here, or you can maybe, I don't know if you can click on it. Ooh, maybe I should copy it into our chat. The URL link, and then you can also scan that QR code and take the survey. And I'll share those results with us as a group once we have finished. So hold on. Put that QR code in that. I'm also not super familiar with presenting on Teams, so I'm orienting myself kind of as we go here. So I'm going to put in the chat that URL link. There we go. And give you guys a few moments to take that survey. I also want to say, while I'm presenting on this, that oh goodness, hopefully that went into the thing. Okay. While I'm presenting on this, that I have to give credit to Tim Hitchens, who used to work at Home in Upua. A lot of the content in this presentation is based on a presentation that I did with him at IVAT a few years ago, maybe about 5 years ago. So it's been an updated, modified version, but I would be misrepresenting if I didn't give him some credit for some of the content in this presentation. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and continue with talking, and hopefully you guys have gotten a chance to take that survey. And I'll share kind of our results at the end as we go through this. Okay, so we did our survey. All right, so the Curtis study, the Curtis 2008 study, is a study that you're going to see referenced quite a bit throughout this presentation because it's probably the most comprehensive study that speaks to this particular topic. But, in their study, they found that about 50% of youth that were commercially sexually exploited were boys. So this does happen to boys, almost as much as it happens to girls. The average age of entry into trafficking was roughly the same for both boys and girls, around 15 years. But boys did indicate that they were a bit younger when they first experienced trafficking. So a larger percentage of boys indicated that they were 13 in comparison to girls at the time they were first trafficked. Boys are rarely identified for a number of reasons, and this is something that we're going to talk about also later in this presentation when I'm going to ask you kind of that question of what we as providers can do differently, or what you think we can do differently. So few agencies screen males for trafficking. It's not something that we often associate with male victims. We often think more so that it is just girls who experience this, or more likely to be girls. Male victims' experiences appear different from what we might normally think about the structure of trafficking. So we'll also see later that a lot of times male victims, not a lot of times, but sometimes male victims do not have a pimp, or doesn't follow that same pattern of a structured pimp or trafficker that we would see in cases of female victims. It's just not as visible. It's not something that we make media about. It's not something that is on, that people have the same level of awareness about when boys are the victims. And places and spaces where boys are involved in trafficking tend to be different than those where girls are involved in trafficking. And it's also rarely the focus of police investigations. And while many boys are arrested for other charges, they're rarely screened for commercial sexual exploitation because, again, it's just kind of not on the radar. There's also, and we're going to talk a lot about this in the presentation as well, there's also some of these feelings of shame and or gendered, the way we think about things in this gendered lens or this gendered language that might prohibit or inhibit boys from coming forward. So adolescent male victims may be unwilling to identify themselves as victims because of feelings of shame or fear of being labeled or perceived as gay. Victims might not self-identify due to the lack of understanding of being a victim. And I think that that is true across genders. So sometimes victims don't think that they are a victim, or don't think that what's happening to them is something that maybe shouldn't be, or they think they have more agency in the situation than maybe they really do. And so it might be hard for them to identify as being a victim. Boys are frequently misclassified as willing participants or offenders instead of being classified as victims because of our gendered stereotypes or our gendered norms that we have. And we have a lack of gender inclusive screening tools, which contributes to this chronic under-identification of this population. Even the language of this slide, I left the language based on the language of the articles, but even the language of this slide implies more agency than maybe a victim might have. But when asked why they're engaged in the lifestyle, boys will have said things in this study like, it's for finances, to survive financially, to explore my sexuality, to make contact with other people who I identify as gay, with money being listed as this major motivator. Yeah, so the literature also notes that sometimes survival strategies that youth are using are being misinterpreted as the youth having agency in the situation instead of the youth experiencing sexual exploitation. And we have this interaction for boys between the stigma around masculinity or being gay and gay homosexuality and this economic vulnerability. So there are some unique risk factors that boys experience that maybe are not the same for girls. Um, so some of these statistics hold true for both boys and girls, but among trafficked youth, 77% report having run away. And 44% of this survey that Curtis conducted identified as being homeless. So still, our most vulnerable population of youth are going to be homeless and runaway teens. In interviews that were done through this Covenant House, kids that were trafficked were often offered bogus work, including opportunities that could be thought of as trafficking, so in pornography or modeling. 19% of youth in the Covenant House, homeless youth, had experienced trafficking at some point, and 60% of those individuals in this study that had experienced trafficking were male. So again, it is happening to boys as much in these studies as it is happening to girls. But boys often avoided shelters or other services because they perceived these facilities to be female focused or they perceived them to be unsafe. So this information on this slide really speaks to this interaction between boy-centric risk factors and LGBTQ identity. So a disproportionate number of boys that were involved in commercial sexual exploitation identified as sexual minorities, and boys were more likely than girls to leave home or, in the next bullet point here, be kicked out of their home because of their sexual identity or being feeling misunderstood around their sexual identity. Family rejection related to sexual orientation was the primary pathway into exploitation for boys in this Friedman study. And LGBTQ plus boys faced a compounded risk due to stigma, homelessness, and lack of affirming services. So while being a runaway or being homeless is a significant contributor for both boys and girls, there are some pieces of that related to sexual identity that may be coming into play here for boys that are not the case for girls. Boys were also more likely to use drugs than their female counterparts. They're more likely to be on probation than their female counterparts. They were more likely to report suicidal ideation than their female counterparts. And they had a lower self-image than their female counterparts. Some of the research notes that risk behaviors are frequently trauma response and not a precursor to exploitation, right? So sometimes we have this this construct in our mind about adolescent male youth, and we think that some of these risky behaviors like drug use are happening before the exploitation is happening. And what the research is telling us is that actually those things are a response to or a coping strategy for the exploitation, not a precursor to the prostitution. And boys' mental distress, we know this from a variety of studies beyond just studies related to trafficking, but boys' mental health distress is often expressed through externalized behaviors, which then get interpreted by the systems that we have in place as conduct-related issues and not maybe signs of this pre-existing abuse or exploitation. Let's see. So I know there's a lot of text on this slide, and I know some of the slides in here are kind of text heavy, but I wanted to make sure to hit kind of all the important points that are brought up by the literature. So the very first point in here is that according to this kind of these large scale data analyses, the year in a man's life or a male's life that is most likely where he's most likely to be the victim of sexual assault is actually the age of 4. So boys are being sexually abused at this very early age, and that is sort of a precursor risk factor related to this later commercial sexual exploitation. Early sexual victimization significantly increases vulnerability to later commercial sexual exploitation. Boys were more likely to enter this commercial sexual market by a consumer approaching them. So in a lot of the data related to girls and trafficking, oftentimes a girl is approached by someone who is posing as a romantic partner, who are identifying themselves as being interested romantically in that girl. In this situation, in the data related in the literature to boys, the most likely way that a boy is approached is by someone directly wanting to purchase sex from them. So being approached directly by the consumer. And also like this last bullet point, I think is a pretty important one, that the lack of a pimp in these trafficking situations is often incorrectly interpreted as a lack of trafficking, right? So because there isn't an adult necessarily who is acting as the trafficker, acting as a pimp, it doesn't mean that that youth is not being exploited or is not being trafficked. Boys who experienced sexual exploitation reported more anxiety, depression, and loneliness, obviously, than their non-exploited peers. I think that holds true for both genders. And in 3 different studies, boys were more likely than girls to report a history of sex for monetary exchange. And that's overall, not just among exploited youth. Excuse me. So there's also, and this gets to that gendered lens related to trafficking for boys that isn't, that brings in kind of this added layer that maybe isn't there when we're talking about with girls. So young men feel this need to be strong and in control, or state that, you know, they should know everything about sex or they should be able to take care of themselves. And in that myths survey that you took at the beginning of this presentation, a lot of the questions in that survey certainly got at these same stereotypes, right? Like the idea that men are in control of the situation, or if sex is happening, that there isn't really any way that you can rape a man or force a man because he's in control in the situation. So these masculinity norms and stereotypes discourage disclosure and help seeking behavior, and they also discourage emotional expression, or they encourage emotional suppression, right? Which means that violence against boys is frequently minimized or normalized in our professional settings. And that's both law enforcement and in therapeutic responses, right? Gender stereotypes also shape our biases as practitioners, leading to missed opportunities for interventions with this population. And like I said, we're going to come back to that myths survey at the end and talk a little bit about like us as a group and what some of our perceptions were on that survey. So kind of this, when I do presentations about trafficking, oftentimes I go through like who's being exploited, who's doing the exploiting, and who's purchasing sex from these kids, right? So girls are more likely than boys or than transgender youth to have a pimp. So girls are most likely to have a pimp or have a trafficker. The majority of youth in this Curtis study, so I mentioned this study was kind of a important study that's referenced repeatedly, right? So 41 youth said that they currently had pimps. And almost all of those youth said that that person was a man, right? So even when boys are the ones being exploited, if they have a pimp, that person is also more likely to be a man. So all youth reported a high likelihood of having their friend, and friend is in quotes, obviously, be the person who brought them into sexual exploitation. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide as well. But the idea that a peer, or the addition of a peer in this equation, kind of grooming you into the market, or bringing you into the market, it confounds some of the investigation and confounds some of the understanding of what's happening, right? So as we saw on a previous slide, boys also were receiving some of these job offers that were bringing them into being the victims of trafficking. So even when boys are the victims, most of the time, 91% of the time, men are still the consumers. So when we're looking at the whole picture here, regardless if the youth who is being exploited is male or female, they are most likely to have a male pimp, and they are most likely to have a male buyer. at least 95% of all commercially sexually exploited boys was provided to sex was provided to adult men. So again, the consumers are still on the demand side, almost always male. Um, but when we have these demand side interventions, so when we have these like mandated trainings that people have to go to when they've been charged with you know purchasing sex, or we have these recidivism programs for people, this demand side intervention rarely acknowledges this male to male exploitation. Mostly all of those interventions are really focused on male to female exploitation. And this failure to confront the demand on the side of boys really creates or makes boys invisible in this equation of exploitation. Okay, so this slide speaks a little more to social service providers and really things that we might think about in terms of services for youth. So this Cole study interviewed 323 service providers who worked with child sex trafficking victims in the US, and 28 reported that they had worked with male victims. So that would be like a fourth of those providers reported that they had male victims. They found that most of their male victims were trafficked through prostitution, and 34% were exploited through pornography. So that's not the topic of this presentation, but certainly there's a pretty strong link between pornography and trafficking, and that can be seen in cases where boys are the victims as well. This Friedman study interviewed 40 social service organizations, or surveyed 40 social service organizations, and only 18 of those, so less than half of those, reported that they would provide services to boys. 37 agencies that provided the specific services, 15 of them, so much less than half of them, said that they would be willing and able to provide those services to boys, and only 10 of them, so only a third of them, had provided services to boys. So thinking about kind of, if you work in social services, the composition of your clientele and whether or not you ever screen boys for these risk factors, or if you've ever provided services for boys who've experienced these things, it's a small proportion of us who have done that or who do that regularly. Most programs were designed for girls and lack the capacity to serve boys safely and effectively. So, in this Friedman study, looking only at organizations that specifically focused on commercially sexually exploited children, only 4 out of 25 organizations could serve boys, and only 2 organizations had provided services to boys, or to more than 5 boys. So again, the pool of services is relatively small for this population. Providers reported uncertainty about how to engage boys without reinforcing stigma, and workforce training rarely addressed male victimization explicitly, right? So it might address victimization broadly or address female victimization explicitly, but it rarely addresses male victimization. Some of these same things are going to be true for the police as well. So boys reported significantly more encounters with the police, and that relates to what we talked about previously about this idea that boys' coping behavior might be this externalized behavior, or that behavior may be misinterpreted as things that are happening before exploitation or leading boys to being exploited, but is actually a response to the exploitation. Boys are more likely to be criminalized due to the absence of visible coercion, or rather, law enforcement's inability to identify the coercion. Boys also report a greater number of arrests and a higher frequency of arrests than girls do. And this Dennis study brought up a good question here. It talks about, when we're thinking about boys and sexual exploitation, whether we're talking about from a policing perspective or from a perspective of clinical services, that often, even subconsciously, when we're doing this in our minds, the question is not, why are boys having sex for money, or why are they being exploited sexually? in the way that we would ask it with girls, but more, well, why do boys want to have sex with men, right? Like it becomes a question about sexuality, not about sexual exploitation. And boys are more likely than girls to be considered offenders. So there's also this phenomenon. Again, I don't know exactly what word I'm looking for there, but there's also this thing that happens that kind of muddies the water around identifying and investigating these situations, where when boys lack this pimp or this formal coercion structure that can be easily identified by law enforcement, they get mislabeled as offenders rather than victims in these equations. And law enforcement's interpretation of what's going on may be affected by other issues like this past criminal record that they might have of arrests, or the youth's demeanor, the officer's sympathy for a particular teenager in these situations, or whether or not, kind of we think about this gendered language of how we think about boys and men as being perpetrators and not necessarily victims. There's also this inconsistency or a lack of trauma-informed, victim-centric approaches for boys in both policing and in social services. But boys also can be offenders. So many boys who start as victims in this particular in commercial sexual exploitation redefine or rebrand themselves as hustlers or escorts, rather than being victims or identifying as prostitutes, in order to deal with this sense of shame and stigma that is occurring, right? So we kind of don't have space in our language or in our conceptualization to think of boys as victims, and so they kind of try to change or assume a different identity. So there were lots and lots of points of intervention or points that we need to do more on here. And I'm going to talk about each of these kind of individually, but some of those would be that we need more research on this topic. So I mentioned at the beginning that there was a lit review done in 2015 that covered literature specific to boys and commercial sexual exploitation. In 2015, they reviewed all articles from 1990 to 2015, and there were only 33 articles published on this topic. And in addition to that, we then reviewed the literature from 2015 to 2025. So in the last 10 years, there was only an additional 4 articles added to the literature, of which one was that literature review that was done in 2015. So there's a lack of research. There's a lack of longitudinal and boy-specific research, and it's seriously needed. And we'll talk more about that on the next slide as well. Because language shapes our perception, we need to have more inclusive language when we're talking about this topic that is inclusive of boys in commercial sexual exploitation. And we need to have these universal screenings that cover this population, that are more gender inclusive across our healthcare settings and across our criminal justice system. And that includes then training for staff to recognize what's going on, to recognize boys as victims, and to recognize the signs of trafficking for boys. And one of the things that the research also found, and this was in that Friedman 2013 article, found that survivor-led, male-staffed mentors and outreach increased trust and increased identification. So this is an area that I think is needed in the services realm, and we need male-centric spaces and safe environments that are affirming for these youth. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the findings from the literature related to each one of these things as well. So in this 2008, so I mentioned there were these 2 studies. So the 2008 study was a systematic review of the literature across genders, so regardless of gender, and they did reviewed 166 articles. So that's kind of the state of things in 2008 related to commercial sexual exploitation overall. Then this 2015 study conducted a systematic lit review, and they found only 33 articles that were published specific to males between 1990 and 2015. And then we found an additional 4 that were published. So that's under 40 articles in what, the last like 35 years, in the last 40 years. So that's not a lot of research around this topic. 84% of the articles in this Denison sample, this larger literature review, were specific to to females, with only 10% being specific to males. The majority of the literature, so 67%, presented the term prostitute as exclusively female prostitute, or sex worker as being exclusively female sex worker. So that gets to that inclusivity of language. So when we're using those words, we're using them in the research almost interchangeably to mean female sex worker, female prostitute, female sexually exploited youth, right? And they're not inclusive. We're using them interchangeably in that way. And so expanding that language to be more inclusive of boys is necessary. 2/3 of the articles concerning female sex workers described violence as the most significant threat, and no article mentioned violence to male sex workers or what their experience of violence might be. The threat of AIDS and HIV appeared in articles related to both males and females, and this was actually a more prominent concern in the literature related to males. And in this Denison study, only 15 of the 166 articles focused on juveniles, and with those, girls were much more likely to be in the literature. So all of that to say, essentially, that research is lacking in this area. We talked a little bit already about this language inclusivity, and this is again, I have to give credit to Tim for this, but this was something that Tim did for this slide when we presented this before. So putting the word prostitute into Google and asking it to generate an image related to that word generates almost exclusively images of women, right? Because again, we're using that word prostitute actually interchangeably or exclusively to mean female prostitute. And we're using that word sex worker or sexual exploitation to almost exclusively or interchangeably refer to women or girls who are being exploited. So this last point in this Curtis article, and this is, across genders, points out to the fact that when you are referring to the person who's doing the trafficking or the person who is doing the pimping or facilitating the trafficking, when you refer to them using words like pimp, youth are less willing to disclose their relationship to them, or less willing to talk about that relationship. Where when you rebrand that with a word like market facilitator, youth are more likely to disclose what's going on and the nature of the relationship with that person. So the way that we are using language in these situations is having an impact on who's coming forward and what they're talking about. Really, the takeaway point from this slide is that we need to have screeners that are gender inclusive across all of our healthcare, welfare, and juvenile justice settings. Studies showed that 88% of trafficked persons see a healthcare provider during the time that they are being trafficked. And that's across genders. So that means that we're missing youth who are actively being trafficked when we're interfacing with them. Few agencies think to screen their male clients for sex trafficking because most of our information about this, and even when you think about flyers that you might see that are anti-trafficking flyers or signs or public service announcements, they are all girl-centric. They're all focused on girls or women, right? Trauma-informed approaches are needed for both social service agencies and law enforcement for this population. And this last bullet point is really just about agencies being able to identify boys that are exploited versus girls that are exploited. So again, we need these gender inclusive screenings across all of our settings. And that includes training for our agency staff. So many young men who are surveyed had experienced sexual exploitation, but again, they were missed, right, by agency staff. And this highlights the lack of training and support for workers in these different settings. And this can result in our failure to identify sexually exploited male youth. Male sex workers, so this is speaking of adults, were assigned considerably more agency than female sex workers when people were thinking about them. And the chief danger ascribed to them was HIV rather than violence, right? So when we think about as social workers or social service workers, we think about, what risks are there. When we think about these things, these are our perceptions. We think about the risk to women being violence, from pimps, from abusers, and we think about the risk to men being HIV. And that leads us to some misconceptions or to addressing the wrong thing when we're working with people who have been victimized in this way. And the last point here in this study is that staff need to be trained to recognize trauma and provide this trauma-informed care. And recognizing that some of these behavioral actions that boys are having are responses to that trauma and not precursors or risk factors for that trauma. Generally, across the research shows that survivor-led male staff in outreach increase trust from youth boys who are commercially sexually exploited, and also increase the level of identification, so the ability for staff to identify boys who had been sexually exploited. This is just sort of a slide about male-centric spaces. So 84% of boys cite job training and housing as the thing that they're needing in order to leave the life or in order to get out of being trafficked. And when you think about a lot of our emergency shelters or even our long-term facilities for commercially sexually exploited youth, again, they tend to be very female-centric. Boys identified that safe, affirming environments reduce these barriers for disclosure, especially when we're talking about youth that belong to the LGBTQ community. So environments that are safe and affirming of this community and of sexual orientation are also helpful in helping boys to come forward. And needed services, and none of these things should be a surprise, but needed services include housing, counseling, commercial sexual exploitation specific programs, male survivor specific programs, male outreach workers, school-based prevention programs that target boys, drop-in centers for street-involved youth, and just general coordination across agencies. And I think that that's something that last point there, coordination across agencies, inclusive of law enforcement, I think is something that's still a need in all trafficking related arenas, not just in relation to boys that are trafficked. So this is just sort of a last takeaway points from the whole presentation. So obviously the first one is that boys are exploited too, almost just as frequently. Inclusive interdisciplinary public health approaches are needed in this arena. Not enough research is done on male victims of trafficking. And effective prevention requires gender inclusivity, gender inclusive policy, gender inclusive practice, and a data system that allows us to accurately identify and capture this population. So I'm going to stop screen share for a minute here. Stop interview. And I guess would like to maybe, and Diane, maybe you can help me facilitate some of this, open up for a little bit of Q&A. I'm going to share the results of our survey. I've got to pull them and put them in the slide. And then I do have some discussion questions if we still have some time at the end that I'd like to pose to the group. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts they'd like to share?
Yeah, feel free to unmute or put it in the chat. Thank you.
It's going to take me just a moment to pull the survey results and then I can share those. So if you give me just a second. Well,
We have
yep. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say we have a question in the chat. Did you see it?
Yes, I do see it. We don't know the data specific to Hawaii. That is one of those areas of research that I think still needs to be done.
Yeah, this is not unusual. We're certainly trying to take strides to improve the situation with the data.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, this has taken a little bit longer for Qualtrics to generate than I was hoping that it would. Let me ask one of the discussion questions to the group then, while I am waiting for this data to download so I can share it.
We do have one question in the
Oh,
chat if you want to
fantastic.
take care of that first.
Mm. So that's a great question. And I can't answer that with ultimate authority because I have not done due diligence as a provider to look for a screening tool that is inclusive. Um, but I just at the beginning of this presentation I shared the male rape myth scale, and that's a not for clients, obviously that's for, us to check ourselves and like think about our own stereotypes and biases. And that's only been relatively recently generated. So I don't know that there are any gender inclusive screening tools that ask about this. And I don't know, I know for myself when I go to see, my primary care provider, I know I get asked a series of questions that ask me about things like relationship violence, but I don't know that my male counterpart gets asked those same questions. So if anybody has any leads on a gender exclusive screener for commercial sexual exploitation, I would love it if you would share them. I don't know of any.
This is a great question, and thank you for bringing it to our attention. I will take this to the C6 steering committee meeting. Thank you.
Yeah. So relation to this question that Elizabeth just asked, so boys are more likely to be approached directly by a buyer than girls are. So girls are most likely to be approached by a trafficker or someone who's posing as a boyfriend or romantic interest for them and then kind of grooms them into sexual exploitation. Whereas boys are likely to be approached directly by somebody wanting to buy sex from them more so than girls are. The number one reason that boys stated for being involved or staying involved in the life was finances, money, a monetary opportunity. I don't know how different that is from girls, as girls also, I mean, those two risk factors of being homeless or having run away are also true for girls. So I think that that just leads us to really when we're thinking about youth who are vulnerable, regardless of their gender, thinking about youth who don't really have a secure family base, right? Like youth who are homeless are vulnerable, youth who are in the foster care system are vulnerable, youth who have run away are vulnerable. So we, even when we're talking about girls, we tend to criminalize runaway youth, right? Like, oh, they're a runaway. Like that's it, like they're running away from like the juvenile detention facility. They're runaways, right? And that becomes almost like a mindset of them as doing something wrong or illegal, rather than a mindset that they are vulnerable to exploitation and people who are seeking to exploit them, whether that person is a pimp or a buyer, is able to identify and target that kid as a vulnerable youth. Any other questions or thoughts folks would like to share? So I have our results from our survey for our whole group. And this kind of gives us, maybe put that in presenter view. Oh, slide. Sorry, guys. Oh, where'd you go? I apologize for that. Technical issues. I'll just leave it in the so we can kind of see here what our results from today when we took the survey were. So this is our group here. And so the red is strongly agree, and then the pink is strongly disagree. So we're seeing the strongly disagree at the top. But for a number of these statements, those of us in this group, we somewhat disagree with the statement, or we neither agree nor disagree, or we somewhat agree with a number of these statements. So, a man can enjoy sex even if it's forced upon him. We somewhat agree with that. Um, I would have a hard time believing a man who told me that he was raped by a woman. We have a number of people in the group that somewhat disagree. or somewhat agree with that statement, so a little more vague. Um, and so this is really kind of highlighting for us that on a number of these myths, we still have some work to do. The one that seems to be, that most of us we're struggling with here are many men claim rape if they have consented to homosexual relations, but have changed their mind afterwards. And obviously, the items on this survey are taken are modified from the female rape myth survey, which really it speaks to some of these same questions about women. So that question that I just asked on the female rape myths survey would read like many women claim to have been raped after having consensual sex and then regretting it, right? Or changing their mind afterwards. And so I think that this does a nice job of highlighting for us when we think about people being forced into sex that they don't want to have, people being sexually exploited, that the gender, we do all have a gendered lens kind of around this topic and around thinking about who can be exploited. Okay, so I'm going to, uh, and I pose this survey, and I do this sometimes in my classes when we talk about certain types of trauma with students, just really for our own awareness. Like, what are some of the areas that I need to do some work on in my perceptions of people? Like, do I actually believe that men should be in control and responsible for the things that happen to them sexually? Like, and that women are not? Like, do I actually adhere to that? So some of those sort of points. So this is really just for your own self-reflection about like, are there some of these stereotypes that I do actually ascribe to that I would need to check myself and work through before I would be effective with this particular population? All right, I'm just going to go to the next slide that has my discussion questions. And I think, we have maybe about 10 minutes left. So if there are no other questions from you guys, I will maybe just pose one of these questions for us to sort of discuss in the next 10 minutes. And I really think of these questions, probably the one that I think is most important for us to think about and talk about is, what do we need to do? What do we need to do differently? What's needed in order for us to be better at this? So what protocols, policies, and practices can we implement at our agencies or our places of employment to better meet the needs of male victims? I'll go ahead and stop sharing. I don't know, Diane, if folks have the ability to unmute or to take their camera on, but I'd love to hear people's thoughts about this.
They should be able to unmute. If you try to unmute and you're not able to, just raise your hand and I'll unmute you.
Could you please repeat the question?
Yeah, so I put the question in the chat as well, but essentially, I'm curious, what protocols, policies, or practices can be implemented at your agency or your place of employment to better serve this population? So, what's some of the things that you think could be done differently that would make a difference?
I think the first step is just doing what you're doing is to start with education because people do have a misconception that this is predominantly or solely a female problem, and it's not. So, I think educating people, maybe getting out flyers with information or handouts, but I think this is a great first step of just trying to educate the general public and get that out there.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe on the advocacy side, we could try things like advocating for more male inclusive or, you know, types of shelters and facilities.
Yeah, I'm not even sure that we have any male specific facilities in the state for this issue.
Oh, then who do we go? Do you know any organizations are that have the capacity or are qualified to like conduct research or I don't know, like is kind of in that space?
I mean, I think there are probably people at both Hawaii Pacific and the University of Hawaii who are qualified and maybe even interested in conducting research. I think the challenge with research is always finding funding to do that research, right? And I don't know that we have, so like we have these big federal policies like the Violence Against Women Act, right? VAWA, which speaks to women facing this issue. And I'm not saying that we don't need those policies, we certainly do. But when we're looking at things under that federal lens, the likelihood that there's funding specifically to research or to take intervention on this issue is smaller because we have federal legislation about it for women. And so I think there are lots of people who are qualified and interested in doing the research, but I don't know if there's funding to do that research. And yeah, I don't know. Any other thoughts about this? You see, we have maybe 5 minutes left. So there's a comment in the chat about shared responsibility for people to heal in order to support this population. So you saw in my introduction that I work in the social work department at Hawaii Pacific, and I think that one of the things sometimes undergrad students ask me, "Oh, should I get my my master's degree in psychology or social work?" Right? Or people will say things like, "Oh, should I major in social work or should I major in something else?" Or I'm gonna major in social work because social work is easy, right? And when people make those statements, I think they have this idea in their head that like I'm not gonna have to do calculus as a social worker, so it's easy. And while the types of math that you do might be different than a chemist or a biologist, I think social services requires this capacity to really self-examine your own perceptions, biases, feelings, opinions, your own emotional reactions to certain things that people say, and to really think about where did those things come from? Do I truly believe that? Do I want to continue ascribing to and believing that? And how does my belief in this particular thing impact my ability to be effective and empathetic and helpful, right? And that's a whole different kind of hard than calculus. And so I think there is some credibility to that statement that if we're going to be effective with this population, that might require us as providers to do some serious self-reflection and to do some healing in order to be able to meet these people where they are. Okay, well, if there's no other thoughts or comments, I guess I thank you all for joining me today for that presentation, and I will give it back to you, Diane, to close up for us.
Thanks, Danielle. I want to thank everyone for joining us here today and sharing this space. This was an amazing presentation, and we appreciate all of the love and appreciation that's being put in the chat. Thank you so much for that. Dr. Danielle Giroux, amazing job. So grateful for having you do this presentation for us today. It is, as everyone well knows, a little outside the box in the way of everyone's thinking. So you've truly added a tremendous piece to this Lunch and Learn speaker series and Human Trafficking Awareness Month. So thank you. Thank you. Everyone else, I put in the chat our upcoming Lunch and Learn speaker series. Friday is the one that needed to be rescheduled, so we hope you'll be able to join us then. That's the Human Trafficking Preventing Off and Online Exploitation Revictimization. And on Monday, the 26th, we have Mary Pacheco from Hina Malka speaking on Hooked and Trapped, Understanding the Link Between Substance Use and Human Trafficking in At-Risk Youth. So everyone, thank you again for being with us today. We hope to see you all again at another Lunch and Learn. Dr. Danielle, thank you. Really appreciate it. And everyone have a great rest of their day. Ahoy ho.